historically, the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a push focused around cleaner air, cleaner water, and looking at any activity that might be emitting us from a smokestack. So an example here would be trash burning or incinerating. And if you do that, then what do you do with the ash? Do you go and dump it in the local river, or is that taken up and disposed of properly as ash? So what we had been seeing was a shift in moving away from higher polluting waste treatment methods and operations, and shifting over to methods that had a lower environmental and human health burden associated with them. The most relevant recent history, historically speaking, at least, the U.S. was a major driver of these regulations. And I'd say the biggest push came in kind of the second half of the 20th century, when there were a number of kind of well-publicized incidents of untreated hospital waste or medical waste washing up on public beaches. And that really spurred a kind of public outcry and garnered public support for the implementation of a series of regulations that would constrain or regulate how medical or potentially infectious waste was handled and treated before it was disposed of, to ensure that those sorts of incidents didn't continue happening. And that was important because, as we saw life expectancies increase dramatically in the 20th century, we also saw a dramatic increase in the number of hospital procedures being performed, the number of hospital visits occurring kind of over a given period of time in countries, and the correlated increase in waste associated with that. One of the other big shifts we saw around that time was the transition from maybe steel or titanium reusable surgical instruments, glass bottles, glass test tubes that were designed to be cleaned and reused, and the transition from that to more single-use plastic devices, tools, with an eye on kind of maintaining patient safety and improving sterility and reducing infectious disease spread kind of in the healthcare setting. One of the drawbacks with that transition, though, which has been absolutely fantastic for public health outcomes, has been the increase in the amount of waste being generated and raising the question of what to do with that waste. So there's a couple of different pressures on the industry right now, which are kind of guiding how it's responding to that challenge. So, one of the bigger pieces is a lot of the new regulation coming out of the EU. So this is on kind of both the demand and supply side, but the EU is mandating a certain amount of recycled or reused plastic in new made or plastic designed to be single-use applications going forwards. So what that does is it increases the demand and increases the price for recycled plastic material. So this creates a positive pressure for groups that are treating healthcare waste, groups that are generating healthcare waste themselves, to look at ways of treating and sending into the recycling market their plastics, because now there's a greater value associated with it. It's maybe worth their time and effort and resources to investigate or make changes in procedure or component makeup to be able to recycle those plastics and sell them into this now growing recycled plastics market. On the other side of things, we're seeing kind of more pressure in terms of corporate accountability. If you have any exposure to the European market, you're being asked to track your waste stream, track your emissions, with the eye that there will be tightening restrictions on those going forwards. So as these groups are now having to take inventories of what they're generating, they're having to put numbers on this, and they're having to face questions from public investors, EU member states, other regulatory agencies. They're seeing an increased pressure to do something different than maybe just send their plastic waste materials to landfill.
Yeah.
So it's a pressure kind of on both sides, largely driven out of Europe. But what that means is a company that operates in the US but has European exposure is still going to be trying to work to those regulations so it doesn't impact their European operations. So we're seeing kind of different pressures in different regions. In Africa, for instance, while there is some of those regulatory pieces kind of driving change there, It's more so pressures around energy availability and landfill space availability, kind of pushing for alternate disposal options because those options just aren't either feasible at all or economically feasible in the same way they are in the US or to a lesser extent the EU. There are some really good heuristics and really good kind of common metrics out there once you start to tally up an inventory. But I'd say the biggest thing is it's really just incremental work. So, a lot of these groups may start off with a very basic or very high level kind of overview or understanding of kind of, some of those more granular emissions or waste related considerations. And then once they've established that, they set themselves a goal for the next year of getting more granular with that, going from scope 1 to scope 2 or scope 2 to scope 3, and really getting a better understanding for what they're touching. And in many cases, kind of where opportunities to increase profits are. If you realize that you're generating and disposing of a plastic that now has a significantly greater market value than it did when you made the decision to dispose of it, maybe it's now worth considering putting in capital equipment to try to recover some of that material. So what we're seeing is kind of this incremental approach, while it doesn't always make for super flashy headlines every month, really does lead to better understanding and improvements in corporate profitability and corporate operations kind of from a year-to-year basis. So, that's a framework that's used when looking at kind of the emissions associated with a company or operation. So scope 1 might be, if I'm running a steel furnace, what's coming out of my smokestack? So that's going to be my scope 1 emissions. My scope 2 emissions are going to be, I have the lights on and I'm running power to things. Where does that power come from? What are the emissions associated with generating that power? So now I'm broadening my scope, which is where the name comes from, beyond just what I'm looking at to, now I'm looking at the emissions associated with a power plant or a blend of power plants that are supplying the energy I'm using to run my operations. And then scope 3 broadens that out even further. So, let's say I have a trash bin that I take out once a week. A truck pulls up, picks up that trash bin and drives off with it. What are the emissions associated with that truck route? What are the emissions associated with the person driving that truck, commuting to work to get in the truck and then commuting back from work? So it's broadening it out sequentially to kind of look at greater and greater breadths of what's happening or what's associated with a certain set of behaviors or actions. So historically, the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a push focused around cleaner air, cleaner water, and looking at any activity that might be emitting us from a smokestack. So an example here would be trash burning or incinerating. And if you do that, then what do you do with the ash? Do you go and dump it in the local river, or is that taken up and disposed of properly as ash? So what we had been seeing was a shift in moving away from higher polluting waste treatment methods and operations and shifting over to methods that had a lower environmental and human health burden associated. One thing we've been seeing there was rather than that being pushed from a prescriptive, we are banning incineration direction, it was being phased out with by layering on additional costs. Yes, you can incinerate, but you have to install scrubbers that meet these requirements. Yes, you can incinerate, but you have to do these things with it. And the increased cost burden of complying with that kind of more organically shifted the market maybe away from incineration or burning into kind of other forms of treatment or handling. Particularly then when coupled with an increase in value of any recycled or recovered material, it helped shift the economics so that there was, not just a prescriptive regulatory, I can't do this, so I'm doing something else, but I can make more money or save money by doing something different. So I want to shift over to that because it will help my operation. So it's tough to say from a policy or a regulatory perspective, what's going to be happening. What we've seen is a substantial amount of course correction or changes in direction from one administration to another. What isn't changing, though, is that there's increasingly cost-effective ways of handling and recovering valuable resources from what was previously viewed as a waste stream. And now that that's out there, I don't think there's ever quite going to be the shift back to just throwing everything away, because that's leaving money on the table. So even in the absence of kind of new regulation driving that, I think as long as that market continues to exist, there will still be kind of a financial and operational incentive to kind of continue moving towards higher recyclability, increased sustainability of operations, because sustainable operations are financially profitable. Yeah, so I think the first step is really to make sure you have a good fundamental understanding of what you're doing now, what your requirements are, and then from there try to understand what are near-term opportunities and what are stretch opportunities. So if you discover that your medical device or a common medical waste stream that you're using or receiving, would be classed as, say, post-consumer recycled plastic, if you were to decontaminate it and send it into the recycling market, you might find that you have a greater value associated with that than you had previously attributed to it. Knowing that, you can sit down and say, okay, if these are my annual volumes that I'm generating or receiving of this type of material, I can all of a sudden put a cost or a value to recovering that, and it makes it easier to build out a business case for doing something. One of the biggest drivers of efficiency increases that we see is when companies are, running truck routes. How efficiently are they loading that truck? Are they, picture a box truck with a single box in the back of it. Well, that's you're wasting a lot of fuel and a lot of time to not move materials very efficiently. If, on the other hand, you can't go from driving that truck every day to driving it once a week full, you're still moving things where they need to go, but you have a substantial increase in the efficiency of that operation. And, in a microcosm, that's really what most of these analyses are looking at. What am I doing now? How can I do what I'm doing now more efficiently? There are many, but they're often going to be very industry or niche specific. So if you're, let's say you're a waste processor, well, where are you located? What are your utility rates? And what does that utility structure look like? Can you shift some operations or some higher energy intensive operations to off-peak times a day? Are there other kind of operational shifts that you can make that are both beneficial from the perspective of kind of greater load management, but then also beneficial in that you pay less to do the same thing. So at the end of the day, you're able to profit more. In the first instance, often hospitals or medical facilities don't have that much agency or choice over what devices or materials they're using. There aren't 10 million different types of medical device X that they can necessarily pick and choose from. For something to be approved as a medical device, it has to go through fairly stringent testing. So just to give an example, when we look at, say, roller bottles, if the bottle is made of the whole bottle is made of one type of plastic and the cap is made of a second type of plastic, that's very easy to treat and recycle. If you have bottles that have multiple types of plastic and stickers and labels, and you start layering things onto that, that becomes more challenging. So you might want to look at that bottle and say, hey, right now we're using something that has 4 types of plastic. I can redesign this to use 1 or 2. Well, to push through that change, you have to submit it, have it approved, have manufacturing ramp up on that, and then integrate it into your purchasing, shipping, and logistics. That's a very long lead process that might involve 3 or 4 different corporate entities who all have slightly different incentives in the process. What we're seeing now is an increase in that sort of change happening because each group along the value chain will have aligned incentives in kind of making those changes. It's in everyone's interest, so we're seeing more of that happen. That is difficult to unilaterally do, so it's tough to be a hospital sustainability manager or another single individual at one of these groups and say, I'm going to do this and we're going to start doing it tomorrow. Often, if you want to go that direction, what that looks like is you pull in someone from the device manufacturer, you pull in someone from a purchasing group, you pull in someone else from a hospital association group, and between the group of you there, you say, here's a change we want to make, here's how we look at it, here's how we can do it in lockstep so that the producers know someone will be purchasing this item from them once they reconfigure it, and the hospitals know that they have a timeline on when that device might become available and regulatory approved so that they can begin using it. So what we're seeing is in cases where that's successful, it's usually a case of industry or private public partnership participation, where it's the group is moving together to affect that change. It's not kind of a single unilateral decision being pushed up or down. This is a group that has operations in the EU, so they're bound by EU regulations and have to comply with that, which is probably behind some of the push here. But on top of just general environmental stewardship and good corporate behavior, from their perspective, they're able to reduce costs and save money on disposal because of the volume at which they operate. So by increasing operational efficiency, moving treatment on site, and then being able to recover value from what would otherwise have gone in the trash and they would be paying someone to take away from them, it can have a pretty substantial economic impact, certainly for a larger company, but to a great extent still small and medium-sized companies for whom that slight delta in cost versus savings might have a more outsized impact. So Takeda is one of the largest blood plasma companies in the world. What that means is they operate donation centers where they collect plasma from donors. They operate testing labs where they test and qualify those plasma donations for patient and production safety. And then they operate production facilities where they convert that plasma into various therapeutics, which are then stored and distributed out for use in healthcare settings. So on a daily basis, they're dealing with thousands or tens of thousands of plasma samples, each in tubes and vials and packaging. They're dealing with larger containers holding kind of the bulk of the plasma donation, and then they're dealing with kind of intermediate containers for stages of intermediate process handling and transport. And anything that touches biological material becomes potentially infectious waste that has to be decontaminated and handled in line with the regulations of the state where that's occurring before anything can happen to it. So they looked at their operations and said, we have these two primary waste streams, one coming out of our production sites, one coming out of our testing sites, that we would like to treat ourselves and divert from landfill to the greatest extent possible. And we were able to sit with them, work out what that would look like, and implement solutions at each of their campuses to be able to process that waste on site and send the bulk of it off to be separated and recycled and sold back into the plastics market as recycled plastic. And their size obviously made the economic case for it very strong, but what really was the biggest driver in their ability to be successful was the repeatability of their process. So the waste they generated, the material they generate this week is very similar to what they generated last week and will be very similar to what they generate next week. That makes it very economical to set up a process to handle and treat that and change what had been a cost center for them into a savings or a profit center. I think one of the biggest things I see is groups looking at it as kind of a additional burden being imposed upon them that they're kind of being forced to comply with, which in some cases that may be an apt description, but in many other cases, as you look at it, it's really an opportunity, and there are often financial incentives paired alongside regulation. It's an opportunity to change a process or an operation that you had been performing and do it in a way that's just more efficient. So, while there might be some initial cost or effort required to kind of get over that initial hurdle, it's generally going to set you up for more profitable, more sustainable, more economical operations down the road. I'd say on the whole, these are trends we're seeing because of organic pressures, running out landfill space, energy is expensive, we're throwing away material that still has residual value. And I think regardless of what may be happening at any one point in time in any one regulatory region, those are trends that are going away. The price of oil may come down, the price of plastic may come down, but plastic's always going to have value. And so if you can find a way to recover it rather than dispose of it, there's always going to be economic pressure to encourage that. So I'd say on the whole, while it kind of comes in fits and spurts, a lot of this regulation or a lot of this direction is likely to kind of continue or even accelerate, particularly as some groups get out in front of it, are able to be successful in it, and other groups try to follow their example.